Oops. Sorry, I'm just messing up my screens. All right. So last week, we talked about Saul. And we talked about how his reign over Israel came to an end. He hit a really low point. The Philistines were coming after him. He felt like he couldn't reach God. And in a desperate act, he turned to a medium, which was strictly forbidden by the law, by God. He basically dialed a beyond the grave phone call to Samuel to see what was going to happen because he felt like God wouldn't answer him. Samuel then told him the truth, which is that Saul was doomed. Doomed! And lo and behold, in the battle against the Philistines killed most of Saul's sons, including Jonathan, his oldest, and basically defeated the Israelite army. So Saul takes his own life rather than let himself get captured by the Philistines. David, meanwhile, wasn't in this battle because if you'll remember, during this time period, he was actively living with the Philistines, but the Philistines didn't trust him to fight beside them because he's Israelite, right? They didn't trust him to fight against his own people on their side, which, wise. So when the Philistines went to war, David and his men were sent back to the Philistine town where they had been living, Ziklag. David comes back to discover the town has been ransacked by a different group, neither Israelites nor Philistines. So while the Israelites and Philistines are battling, David basically mounts a successful rescue of the people in his village who have been kidnapped. So that's where we pick up. Saul is dead. Israel has no king. What's going to happen? So, I should say that also brought us to the end of 1 Samuel. So now we're going to start 2 Samuel. So 1 Samuel is kind of all about Saul and his reign and the civil war with David. And 2 Samuel is really going to be about David and David's reign. So 2 Samuel 1 through 4. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. On the third day, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance. David said to him, "Where have you come from?" He said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did things go? Tell me." He answered, "The army fled from the battle, but also many of the army died, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died." So Saul is dead. David is still hanging out in Ziklag, the Philistine town where he and his men live. Then a man shows up, a really dirty and desperate looking man. Just from our perspective, when it says his clothes are torn and dirt is on his head, that doesn't even necessarily mean like he's just like dirty and looks like he's been on the road a lot. That's also like grief, like they would tear their clothes and stuff. So he's grieving, right? So David wasn't at the battle. So David asks what happened, right? And it turns out this man just came from the Israelite camp. So he knows, and he tells him that Israel's been defeated. Saul and his son, Jonathan, are dead. So the news of Jonathan's death would be a double whammy, right? Because Jonathan was Saul's oldest son and therefore heir. So if Saul died, Jonathan should have been the next king. But Jonathan was also David's best friend. So this is not something David would be happy to hear. Even though it means the throne is pretty much clear for him, that he can become king, no obstacles. His best friend died. His BFF. The Bible describes him as soulmates, right? This is someone who he cares deeply about. At first, David doesn't believe it. And he basically interrogates the man as to how he could possibly know these things. But then the man tells a story of how Saul died, and he provides proof. He has the crown of Saul. And Saul would never let that crown go, especially not to a random dude. So finally, David believes him, and he is filled with grief. And the rest of this chapter is basically David expressing that grief. David is sad not only because his best friend Jonathan is dead, but he's also sad for Saul. Because remember, at one point, David did work for Saul, and he thought very highly of him. And yes, this all might mean David is king now, but it seems to have come at a very terrible price. Israel has been defeated by the Philistines. Jonathan and Saul are dead. This is not good news. 2 Samuel 2, 1 through 7. Oh, this only shows 1 through 4. 1 minute. Let me pull up Bible Gateway. Bible Gateway. 2 Samuel 2, 1 through 7. Okay. After this, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?" The Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" He said, "To Hebron." So David went up there along with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David brought up the men who were with him, every one with his household, and they settled in the towns of Hebron. Then the people of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. When they told David it was the people of Jabesh Gilead who buried Saul, David sent messengers to the people of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, "May you be blessed by the Lord, because you showed this loyalty to Saul your Lord, and buried him. Now may the Lord show steadfast love and faithfulness to you. And I too will reward you, because you have done this thing. Therefore let your hands be strong and be valiant, for Saul your Lord is dead, and the house of Judah has anointed me king over them." So David prays to God, asking what he should do. Right now, he's still in Ziklag, and he wants to know if he should go back to Israel, specifically to the cities of Judah. If you'll remember, Judah is the tribe that David belongs to. So Judah would be the tribe most likely to welcome him back. This is essentially his family, right? And God tells him, yes, to go back, specifically to the town of Hebron. So David packs up all of his men and their families and his family, and they travel to Judah. When they get there, the people anoint him king over the house of Judah. Judah is just one tribe of Israel. Remember, there are 12 tribes of Israel. That means right now, David is just king of one tribe and not all of Israel. It's not really the plan, right? But it is a start. The people also give David news about where Saul is buried, and David basically thanks them and says God will reward them for their hard work and loyalty. Why is David king of only Judah and not all of Israel? Well, they don't have fast communications back then, right? So the other parts of Israel wouldn't even know David is back yet. But also, Saul and Jonathan may be dead, but Saul had more than one son. A lot more than one son. So, next section. 2 Samuel 2, 8 through 11. But Abner, son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbaal, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, the Asherites, Jezreel, Ephraim, Benjamin, and over all Israel. Ishbaal, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So Abner, son of Ner, how would you like your name to be Ner? Makes me wonder if Abner means like from Ner. Does probably mean like imposing Latin on it, because ab is a preposition in Latin, though I don't think it means from. I'd have to go back and look. But Abner, the commander of Saul's army, finds Ishbaal, who I think is Saul's 4th son, because Jonathan and his next 2 oldest sons all died in the battle with the Philistines. So Abner sets Ishbaal in place as king over Israel, which it says he reigns as king for 2 years, while the house of Judah follows David. So right here we have a split Israel. We have Judah versus the rest of Israel proper. Judah is led by David, while the rest of Israel is led by Ishbaal, the son of Saul. This is the first time we have a split Israel with 2 kings, but it will not be the last. Now it says in this section that David is king over Judah for 7 years, but Ishbaal was only king for 2. So the implication here is that David came back to Judah right after Saul's death and established his kingdom there, while the rest of Israel was still in disarray from the Philistines' defeat. So for several years, it seems the Philistines were in charge, and they didn't allow an Israelite king. Then after 5 years or so, the Israelites finally managed a king. Now, it's also possible, because so many years passed, they would know David is king over Judah, but these people wanted a son of Saul. They wanted a continuation of their original dynasty that would remind them of Israel's peaceful days under young Saul. They also know that Saul was chosen by God, so it would make sense to them that Saul's son should therefore be king after them. Because remember, David wasn't chosen as king publicly. Saul was chosen as king in a very public setting, right? There was that whole lottery. Everyone saw it. Saul hid with the luggage. Off to a great start there, Saul. Whereas David was anointed very privately, and there has not been a very formal, large announcement of David as king. So I don't want you to think of these people as like traitors or something to David or to God. Like, they're doing what they think is right. But we know God intends David to be king over all Israel. So the split to this kingdom is not going to last. So we shall see what happens. Let me drink a little bit of tea. There was a long war between the 2 Samuel 3, 1-6. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab of Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. The third, Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, son of Abital, and the sixth, Ethream, of David's wife, Elga. These were born to David in Hebron. While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making him strong in the house of Saul. The whole purpose of this section is to show that David is growing strong and to set up a contrast of what's happening in the house of Saul, that is with Ishbaal. So while in Judah, David is doing well, right? He's having multiple sons and who knows how many daughters, because they never counted daughters. And that's just not to show how many kids David has. But back then, that would be considered a sign of David's awesomeness or something like that. To show that God is blessing him with so many strong male heirs. But the house of Saul doesn't seem to be getting along so well. Ishbaal, Saul's son, was made king basically because he had Abner's loyalty. Abner being Saul's old buddy and commander. Without Abner's support, Ishbaal would not be able to make it. He wouldn't be able to keep the throne. He wouldn't have gotten the throne. And it is Abner, now Ishbaal, not Ishbaal, who is making the house of Saul strong, even though it is Ishbaal who is technically king. Now, we don't know if Abner was doing this for his own glory or if he, was doing it for other reason. I think Abner was honestly a good friend and a loyal follower of Saul. And he was just doing what he thought was best for his old friend. But it seems Ishbaal did not feel so kindly towards Abner, and maybe felt as if Abner was a threat to him, because as soon as he gets a chance, Ishbaal accuses Abner of basically sleeping with one of Saul's wives. This makes Abner furious, because sleeping with one of his dead friend's wives is just wrong, and he didn't do it. And he feels like he's being betrayed by the very man he helped set up as king. And he's not entirely wrong. And this is probably the most critical error of Ishbaal's kingship, because Abner was the only person keeping him on the throne. And Ishbaal just made him very angry. Angry enough to start talking to David. So, 2 Samuel 3:12-16. Abner sent Abner sent messengers to David at Hebron, saying, "To whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me, and I will give you my support to bring all of Israel over to you." He said, "Good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you, you shall never appear in my presence unless you bring Saul's daughter, Michal, when you come to see me." Then David sent messengers to Saul's son Ishbaal, saying, "Give me my wife Michal, to whom I became engaged at the price of 100 foreskins of the Philistines." Ishbaal sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping as he walked behind her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, "Go back home." So he went back. Abner sends messages to David and is basically like, "I am ready to throw my support in with you and make you king over all Israel. I'm done with Ishbaal." And David is like, "Awesome. One small thing first. Remember back in the day when Saul gave me his daughter Michal to be my wife? And then when Saul got angry at me, he just gave her to somebody else? Well, I want her back. And you will never step foot in my presence without her." And Abner's like, "Cool, I've got that." But basically, David also sends a message that he wants Michal back to Ishbaal. For whatever reason, Ishbaal agrees to give Michal to David, possibly because Abner tells him it's part of his deal with David, and possibly because Ishbaal is trying to buy peace between the two kingdoms. But But remember, Saul gave Michal to another man, and her new husband is a bit upset about all of this because it's been a long time, right? There's been like a whole war going on, and he tries to follow her. But Abner tells him to go back home, and Abner is powerful enough and intimidating enough that the man listens. What does Michal want to do? I have no idea. The Bible doesn't tell us, and the men don't really care, because that is basically how they rolled back then. Michal was just a bargaining chip on the table between these two kingdoms, which is really unfortunate, but that was the reality of women's lives in the ancient world, especially on kind of this whole kingdom scale. 2 Samuel 3:17 through 21. Abner sent word to the elders of Israel, saying, "For some time past you have been seeking David as king over you. Now then, bring it about, for the Lord has promised David, through my servant David, I will save my people Israel from the hand of the Philistines and from all their enemies." Abner also spoke directly to the Benjamites. Then Abner went to tell David at Hebron all that Israel and the whole of Benjamin were ready to, and the whole house of Benjamin were ready to do. When Abner came with 20 men to David at Hebron, David made a feast for Abner and the men who were with him. Abner said to David, "Let me go and rally all Israel to my lord the king, in order that they may make a covenant with you, so that you may reign over all that your heart desires." So David dismissed Abner, and he went back in peace, or went away in peace. So Abner, having provided Michal back to David, as they previously agreed upon, with no input from Michal. Is she happy to be back? I don't know. He then goes on in a full pro-David campaign mode. He's sending letters. He's, telling people of his support. He's telling leaders and elders that he's put his support behind David, that David is not Ishbaal, but David is the king God has promised them. He also goes directly to the Benjamites to talk to them. Why would he talk to them personally and not any of the other tribes? Well, what tribe did Saul belong to? Benjamin, right? So if any clan was going to hold out against David in support of Ishbaal, it would be the tribe that Ishbaal belongs to. But Abner is so persuasive that basically all of Israel plus Benjamin is ready to say David is their king and forsake Ishbaal. So Abner goes to David, David throws him a party, and Abner is like, "My work isn't yet done. I'm going to keep rallying the people for you. Is that cool?" And David's like, "Yeah, definitely, man." So David leaves the feast to continue bringing people over. So Abner leaves the feast to continue bringing people over to David's side. Abner has basically 100% defected at this point and is taking all of Israel with him. Poor Ishbaal. But not everyone, even on David's side, is happy to see this former enemy come into the fold. So 2 Samuel 3:22 through 25. 2 Samuel 3:22 through 25. Just then the servants of David arrived with Joab from a raid, bringing much spoil with them. But Abner was not with David at Hebron, for David had dismissed him, and he had gone away in peace. When Joab and all the army that was with him came, it was told Joab, "Abner, son of Ner, came to the king, and he has dismissed him, and he has gone away in peace." Then Joab went to the king and said, "What have you done? Abner came to you? Why did you dismiss him so that he got away? You know that Abner, son of Ner, came to deceive you, and to learn your comings and goings, and to learn all that you're going to do." So just after Abner leaves, a follower of David named Joab shows up, having returned from battle. So this is like a commander, right? And when he hears that David allowed Abner to come to Hebron in peace and then didn't kill him, but instead let him go in peace, he's furious, right? Abner is their enemy, or at least he was until very recently. Abner was literally Saul's right-hand man who has been leading troops against David for years. And Joab just can't let go of that. He thinks Abner has come to deceive David and that he couldn't actually possibly have turned his back on the house of Saul, and that it'll be David's downfall to trust Abner. Now, we know that's not the case because we know Abner is not happy with Ishbaal and has defected. But Joab would only have the secondhand word of David that Abner has defected. And if he thinks David has been bamboozled, it makes sense he might try to take matters into his own hands. 2 Samuel 3:26 through 30. When Joab came out from David's presence, he sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the cistern of Serah. But David did not know about it. When Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gateway to speak with him privately, and therefore he stabbed him in the stomach. So he died for shedding the blood of Asahel, Joab's brother. Afterward, when David heard of it, he said, I and my kingdom are forever guiltless before the Lord for the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May the guilt fall on the head of Joab and on all his father's house, and may the house of Joab never be without one who has a discharge, or who is leprous, or who holds a spindle, or who falls by the sword, or who lacks food. So Joab and his brother Ashbai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle of Gibeon. Whew. Drama. So Joab leaves David with a plan. Not with David's plan, with his own plan. He sends messengers after Abner, and maybe the messengers seem peaceful. Like, hey, we just want to talk, We don't know. All we know is that David didn't know about it, and for whatever reason, Abner agrees to meet with Joab. Joab greets Abner as soon as he appears, and then is like, come over here where we can talk privately. No one will see us. And then instead of talking, he just stabs him in the stomach. Which is a slow and awful way to die, by the way. And pretty much a death sentence, especially back then. Today, you'll probably be fine, modern medicine. But back then, you were just dead. We also learned that part of the reason why Joab is so mad is that he holds Abner responsible for the death of his brother. So Joab is not just doing what he thinks is necessary to protect the king. This is an act of revenge. David is furious when he hears of this, and he's basically so mad at Joab that he basically wishes Joab and his entire family would die horrible deaths for the acts of Joab. Which is kind of like revenge for revenge, but David doesn't actually do anything, right? He just says it. David then leads his people in mourning for Abner, and they bury him in the city of Hebron. And David is so desolate over Abner's death that he doesn't eat. He also tells everyone that a great champion of Israel has died, showing he thinks of Abner as a hero for all of his service to Israel and not as an enemy for following Saul's orders. All of this convinces the people that Joab didn't kill Abner on some secret order of David's, but also works to show people that David is not going to hold against them that they were loyal to Saul. In the new kingdom, there will be a place for everyone, and service to Israel will be credited as service to Israel, no matter which king it was for. Meanwhile, David is still not king over all Israel yet because Ishbaal still exists. Why doesn't David just kill him? Assassination would take care of all of this, right? But remember, David promised both Jonathan and Saul that he wouldn't kill any of Saul's descendants. That includes Ishbaal. And David's not going to back down on his word because he made a covenant. And a covenant's not just between him and them, it's between him and them and God. And that covenant is going to last as long as David lives. So let's see what happens next. 2 Samuel 4, 5-8. Now the sons of Rimnon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, set out, and about the heat of the day they came to the house of Ishbaal while he was taking his noonday rest. They came inside the house as though to take wheat, and they struck him in the stomach. Then Rechab and his brother Baanah escaped. Now they had come into the house while he was lying on the couch in his bedchamber. They attacked him, killed him, and beheaded him. And they took his head and traveled by the way of Arabah all night long. They brought the head of Ishbaal to David at Hebron and said to the king, Here is the head of Ishbaal, son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. The Lord has avenged my lord the king this day on Saul and on his offspring. So, two random dudes, Rechab and Baanah, brothers, basically kill Ishbaal. They find him while he's resting from the heat. He's taking a nice siesta, and they kill him. They also take off his head, and they escape with his head and take it to David, and they're like, ha, look what we have done. We've killed your enemy. Aren't you so happy with us and going to reward us and probably make us nobles in this new kingdom? No. David is not happy with this. 2 Samuel 4, 9-12. David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when the one who told me, See, Saul is dead, thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag. This was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more then, when wicked men have killed a righteous man on his bed in his own house? Now shall I not require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? So David commanded the young men, and they killed them. They cut off their hands and feet. They hung their bodies beside the pool at Hebron. But the head of Ishbaal they took and buried in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. As we predicted, David is angry. He tells them that when the men came to tell him Saul was dead, he also thought, uh, sorry, I lost my thought. So when the men came to tell him Saul was dead, they also thought they would get rewarded. And instead, David killed them. Do they really think David is going to be happy he killed a man while he was sleeping? So David has the two men put to death and basically hangs them as if they're traitors. Because in a way, they are. They killed the king of Israel. You'll notice if you study history that once people get it in their heads it's okay to kill a king, they start thinking they can depose of any king, which is definitely not what David wants. But also David didn't want Saul's family killed. He had nothing against Ishbaal. And I'm sure David thought they could work something out, that eventually he and Ishbaal would come to some sort of agreement. But instead, these two guys killed him. David buries the head of Ishbaal in the same tomb as Abner. So now the king of Israel is dead, and David is the only king left standing. 2 Samuel 5, 1-5. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Look, we are your bone and flesh, and for some time while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be ruler over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king of Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Without any other king, the people come to David, all tribes, and are like, "Will you be our king?" And they make David king over all of Israel. And instead of remaining in Hebron, where it might seem like he's favoring Judah, he sets up his capital in Jerusalem. And thus, after everything, after this whole civil war, David is finally king of all Israel, just as God had declared all those years ago when he was just a youngest son who wasn't even important enough for his father to bring him to meet the prophet Samuel. It's been a long road, and he's now king. But this is not the end of David's story. It doesn't end right here with a happily ever after. Things are never going to go smoothly for David, and this drama is not going to end. Because for all that David is a man, often called a man after God's own heart, he is still a man. He is imperfect, and his reign will also be imperfect. So the story of David is, as they say, to be continued. So, that is the end of today's lesson. Let me pull up OBS. Stop the recording.